Spectacular Spider-Man is a phenomenal show I've talked about on the show before, although something I mostly left out in that original video is my absolute love for a certain episode of the show. Episode 23, Gangland. And that's because I think the episode is a phenomenal example of how to end one era of your show to set a transition into a new one, or at least partially. While I wouldn't say the show fully changes after this episode, it does set up the major playing cards for what would have been the next season of the show's villains, while also doing a great job at finalizing the conflict of some of the show's current biggest villains in a satisfying way. And on top of that, it has the best fight scene in the series and some phenomenal direction just to really nail home how fantastic this episode is. So let's begin with... The main players throughout the first half of the show have been Tombstone and second-in-command Hammerhead, with Dr. Octopus being a newer but just as formidable player at the table. Tombstone was formally introduced in episode 6 after Spider-Man defeated the Rhino and made him spill on who the big man is. Spider-Man then goes and confronts him in one of the most iconic scenes from the whole show, gets his ass kicked in mere seconds as Tombstone explains everything to him and presents Spider-Man with a morally challenging conundrum.
Don't move, just listen. And I'll teach you the facts of life. The big man, whomever he might be, has nothing against heroes. Come work for me. You can still save the world like a good hero. I'll even pay you. All you have to remember is to look the other way on occasion. On any occasion I choose.
Join Tombstone and get paid on the condition that Spidey turns a blind eye or continue opposing him. And while Spider-Man will have altercations with Tombstone in the future, they're never an actual full-out fight. In fact, most of the time Spider-Man is having to save Tombstone from worse villains like the Green Goblin, which ends up putting salt in the wound that Spider-Man can't stop him yet. Dr. Octopus was introduced just 2 episodes later. He's demonstrated some immense power and danger, forming and leading this show's series to 6 and giving Spider-Man some of his closest calls yet. The final player at the table is Silvermane, and while being the newest introduced in the show, his crime family has run the scene for years. The other players are Silvermane's daughter, Silver Sable, and Tombstone's second-in-command Hammerhead, who, while having fought previously in the show, have had more of a banterous rivalry than a strong hatred for each other. Now, while that's Spider-Man's conflict established, it wouldn't be a proper Spider-Man story if I didn't also mention Peter Parker's conflict. At this point in the show, Peter Parker is currently dating Liz Allen, and while it's been established that he actually has feelings for Gwen Stacy, he's pretty unaware of it. Even despite that, it's a dynamic that puts Peter in a bad light to the audience, especially given how well developed Peter and Liz's relationship has been. Even if you're rooting for Peter and Gwen, you still feel bad for Liz. Although, Gwen is doing the same thing Peter is to Liz to Harry Osborn, someone who's been put through the ringer the whole series from his neglectful father who prefers Peter to his own son, to the twist that Harry Osborn was the Green Goblin in episode 10, an alter ego that developed because of an experimental drug he took to make himself better so he'd be better respected by the people in his life, which is a rather human and sympathetic reasoning. Gwen dates Harry simply because she doesn't want to say no to him, even though she likes Peter, and when it doesn't come back to bite her in this episode, it will in the finale just after this episode. And speaking of this episode, we're finally ready to go into why it's my favourite. Literally within the first minute of the episode, everything is quickly established or re-established. The two grunts arguing about turf establishes the conflict between Silvermane and Hammerhead, which is good since it was only introduced a few episodes ago. The episode quickly begins with the aftermath of Spider-Man having just stopped 2 grunts, both of which are arguing about turf belonging to either Tombstone or Silvermane, while Spider-Man complains that stopping them got in the way of him buying flowers for Liz tonight, establishing the Peter Parker side of the episode. We then cut to Peter arriving at this party where we introduce to Gwen, Peter and Harry and their dynamic, before moving to inside excluding a JJJ appearance. I'm going to mostly be ignoring Jameson in this video, but I really want to state that he's amazing, I just don't want to go off on too many tangents. It's Valentine's Day, and however commercial it all is, it's still an important day for couples. Even Flash Thompson wants to make sure his date doesn't hate him and asks Peter for help, which is an arc that starts a few episodes before this and probably would have concluded in the following season, and what we see here is great.
Okay, Parker, here's the deal. You need to make sure I don't say nothing to make Shashan think I'm stupid.
Dude, ship sail.
Shut up!
There's this little moment where Peter's worried about how he'd pay for the meal with his limited cash, and Liz tells him not to worry because she's got a connection to the manager, and it's just a scene that is just really helpful for building this relationship, and shows that Liz really does care for Peter. Meanwhile, in an opera building in another part of the city, Tombstone, Silvermane and Doc Ock begin a discussion about their territory, while Hammerhead, Silver Sable and the Vulture stand by as guards for each of them respectively. They drink water in wine glasses and throw semi-backhanded insults to each other as the opera goes on in the background. This scene is a rather interesting if simple look at how each of them view their criminal empires.
Here's the bottom line. The Manfredi families ruled New York for decades. You are not taking what is mine. You old school types always make things personal. But a criminal empire should be run like a business.
Not a business, a science.
I think it's really interesting the way that each of the characters lay out their philosophies. Even if you could probably guess by their actions throughout the series, it's really cool that the writers are also aware of it. Then Hammerhead finds a letter saying, "Hope you like the flowers," and it's pretty clear that he sees this as his opportunity. Since the start of the series, we've seen Hammerhead's devotion to Tombstone falter as Tombstone relies on supervillains like the Rhino to do his work rather than Hammerhead. So it's fully justified in the next scene where he uses the flowers as an excuse to take Silver Sable out of commission and then throwing a gun at Tombstone and declaring,
Your plan worked, boss. Take him. What?
he pins the blame on Tombstone and a fight breaks out. This is where the opera picks up in the background and a really interesting directorial choice. Bar the scenes at the restaurant and the opening, this whole episode is scored using this opera. And aside from some visual references and one gag from Spider-Man, it remains in the background, almost exclusively an audio component. It makes this already brilliant episode stand on its own thanks to this uniqueness. The fight between them escalates. The big three leave their henchmen behind and they fight in a more open space for what will be, in my opinion, one of the most dynamic and complex fights in the series. We then see disposable side character Patches call other disposable side character Robbie at the Bugle, who then calls Peter, giving him an excuse to show up. He apologizes to Liz and Flash, but especially apologizes to Gwen, which leaves Liz out in the cold in a pretty brutal way. Cutting back again to the fight, Tombstone tries diplomacy, but given a mix of the unbelievability of why Hammerhead would step out of line and the opportunity to take Tombstone out of the picture, it doesn't help him at all. Doc Ock then turns on Silvermane, making the fight go from 2 parties to 3, and then Spider-Man pretty much immediately joins in, making the fight go from 3 parties to 4. The fight continues, eventually making its way outside. The best character in the whole show, George Stacy, also shows up, and one of my favourite little cues here is that because Hammerhead is in public and he is not publicly a villain, he has to ally with Spider-Man for a bit, making the fight less confusing as it goes back down from 4 parties to 3. Directors Victor Cook and Jennifer Coyle are really flexing their directing skills here, since on top of all of that possibly confusing information, at different points during the fight, all 3 villains try to call for some kind of backup. Hell, to make sure the audience really notices it, Jameson even tries to make a call but it gets cut off, although when Silver Sable confronts Hammerhead about this, he didn't even know about any kind of communication jam, which immediately establishes that there might be even more going on here than first meets the eye. Cutting back to it, this fight is spectacular, pun fully intended. The animation isn't groundbreaking or on par with any phenomenal anime or anything, but movement is still weighty and actions are directed well enough that the fight never loses its steam and you're never really taken out of it. Despite almost the whole fight having at least 3 parties fighting each other, it remains easy to follow and appreciate. And during all of this, we get shots back seeing at how Peter ditching Liz understandably affects and hurts her, but we're constantly reminded during the fight that he has to be there, he has to save these civilians from being caught in the crossfire. If you're paying enough attention between all the scenes, it can feel almost suffocating. Eventually, Spider-Man takes out Silvermane on the surface, but the remaining 3 fighters fall underground. Luckily for him, the remaining 2 fighters are 2 Spideys already fought, and while Tombstone could be a problem, he's out cold because of the fall. Watching Spidey then so easily take out Doc Ock is super satisfying considering all the shit he's put Peter through in the show. But after that, Tombstone gets back up and we get a callback exchange between them.
I assume you remember our last physical encounter.
Painfully. But I told you then, I don't look the other way.
And a fight breaks out between them. The sounds of blows exchanging eventually fades out, and all that's heard is just the opera singing in the background. Finally, we have this confrontation between them, something that's been built up for over half the show. It makes for one of the most satisfying moments in the series, although nothing Spidey does is ever so long-lived. Despite Spidey taking out 2 of his biggest foes, one of which he's never defeated before, pretty much immediately after, we cut back to Peter meeting Liz's brother and understandably being told to piss off. Then, after all the conflict is over, we get a scene establishing that Tombstone made bail, but thanks to Spider-Man, the government, his operation is crippled. And soon after, Tombstone confronts the mastermind behind it all, the Green Goblin, and then credits roll. In summary, Gangland is my favourite episode of my favourite Spider-Man show for all the reasons I've illustrated in this video. The fact that it's by all means a culmination of Spidey's encounters with all three of these characters, a setup for the future of the series in both Spider-Man's villains in the next season, but also Peter Parker's struggles for the rest of this season. It's a satisfying episode for long-term viewers who get to see how Spider-Man's grown, be able to both best Doc Ock in record time, but also finally beat Tombstone, a villain who's narrowly been avoiding justice for the whole series. And that's why Gangland is my personal favourite episode, but that isn't even the series finale, which is great in its own way. But that's a video for another day. Maybe.